back to my channel. I'm gonna finally finish Killer Kids Volume 1. So here's the next 3 stories. Also, I hope everybody had a very, very Merry Christmas. Let me know how it went in the comments below. Let's get right into it. Number 1, Dedrick Owens. Even at the tender age of 6, teachers at Theo J. Bull Elementary School knew that Dedrick Owens was trouble. The little boy was known to taunt and bully his first-grade classmates, punching, slapping, and pinching them. Once he'd beaten a boy who had refused to give him a pickle from his lunchbox. On another occasion, he'd stabbed a little girl with a pencil. He also routinely peppered his speech with the F word and had been sanctioned for trying to kiss his classmates. All of this had led him being flagged under the Primary Mental Health Project, a national initiative aimed at identifying children with aggressive tendencies. He was scheduled to see a psychiatrist. But not all of the blame for his destructive behavior could be laid at the little boy's feet. He'd hardly had the most auspicious start in life. Dedrick was born in Flint, Michigan in 1993. His mother, Tamarla, was a shop assistant, while his father, Dedrick Darnell Owens, was a work-shy individual of no fixed employment other than the criminal kind. He would be behind bars for at least a third of his son's life, usually on drugs and theft charges. Inevitably, this put a strain on the marriage, and in March 1999, while Dedrick was serving yet another jail term, Tamarla filed for divorce. Single parenthood was not easy for Tamarla, especially with 3 children to feed and drug problems of her own to contend with. She worked 2 jobs, but the $250 she earned a week wasn't enough to cover her bills. Eventually, she fell into arrears with her rent and was evicted from her home. Tamarla then moved in with her sister, taking a 5-year-old daughter with her. Her 2 young sons are placed with their uncle, Marcus Winfrey, in Mount Morris Township, Michigan, at a property that was known to police as a crack house. Life must have been difficult for the boys, just 6 and 8 years old respectively, and placed in a situation with no parental care or adult supervision. Their junkie uncle certainly was not going to fulfill that role, and their mother barely bothered to visit them at the house on Julia Avenue, a sparsely furnished hovel with flaking paint and cracked window panes. The boys were left mainly to their own devices and spent much of their time wandering the streets or sitting on the porch, watching the steady stream of crackheads heading into and out of the property to shoot up. By night, they slept on a filthy mattress in the living room, their slumber interrupted by inebriated adults shooting up, quarreling, or having sex. Given this background, it is perhaps unsurprising that young Dedrick Owens was gaining such an unsavory reputation at the nearby Bull Elementary School. The boy was a handful to the teaching staff and a threat to his classmates with whom he was in constant conflict. His latest confrontation had been with a little girl named Kayla Rowland. Kayla was one of the girls who had refused Dedrick a kiss, and he had responded by spitting on her dress. The two then had a verbal exchange, which was quickly broken up by a teacher. Dedrick, however, continued to harbor a grudge. On February 29, 2000, he arrived at school, determined to make Kayla pay for challenging him. Early on that Tuesday morning, a student alerted a teacher to the fact that Dedrick Owens was carrying a knife. The teacher then challenged Owens about the weapon, and he reluctantly handed it over. But what the teacher did not know was that the 6-year-old had another weapon in his person, a fully loaded Davis .32 semi-automatic. This is a pocket-sized pistol designed for easy concealment. Owens had found it in his uncle's room the previous night and had brought it to school with him, intent on using it. Shortly before 10 a.m., the first graders were heading upstairs for a computer training class. Kayla was walking ahead of Owens on the stairs when he suddenly shoved her in the back and told her, "I don't like you." Kayla then turned and challenged him with a typical juvenile gesture. "So?" She pouted, hands on hips. It was then that Owens pulled the gun. A single shot was fired, entering the 6-year-old's abdomen under the armpit and chewing through vital organs on its path. Kayla grabbed her chest and collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. A teacher who was following close behind ran forward, took one look at the little girl, and immediately punched 911 into her cell phone. In the meantime, Owens had made a run for it. He was later found hiding in a restroom, the gun hidden in a trash can nearby. Kayla, meanwhile, was being given first aid by the paramedics who had arrived on the scene. She was rushed to Hurley Medical Center but was pronounced dead on arrival at 10:29 a.m. In the aftermath of the shooting, the school principal ordered a lockdown of all classrooms. Soon the halls would be crawling with police officers, and then, as word got out, with concerned parents arriving to take their children home. Dedrick Owens, of course, wasn't going home. He was taken to a nearby police station for questioning. Owens at first tried to lie his way out of trouble. "Someone else shot the gun," he said. Then after officers told him that other kids had seen him firing the weapon, he changed his tune. He said that he'd brought the gun to school to scare people like on television, had shot Kayla because she had angered him by slapping his hand. But despite that admission of guilt, Dedrick Owens was never going to be charged with any offense. A U.S. Supreme Court statute dating back to 1893 stipulates that no one under the age of 7 years can be found guilty of a felony. If anyone was going to take the fall, it was going to be the person who had left the loaded firearm within easy reach of a child. That person turned out to be 19-year-old Jamel James, who lived with his uncle at the crack house and owned the murder weapon. James would eventually plead no contest to involuntary manslaughter and would spend 2 years behind bars before being released. No one else has ever been brought to book for the senseless killing of Kayla Rowland. Dedrick Owens and his brother were given up by their mother in the aftermath of the shooting and replaced in foster care. The Buell Elementary School closed its doors in 2002 due to a sharp fall in enrollments. The building was demolished in 2009. Story number 2. Marlene Olive and Chuck Riley. Jim and Naomi Olive were a golden couple. She, a one-time beauty queen, he, a senior executive in the oil industry who was tipped for the very top. The couple lived an opulent lifestyle in Norfolk, Virginia, but if there was one thing missing from their lives, it was a child. After receiving the devastating news that Naomi was unable to conceive, they decided to adopt. In 1959, they brought home a newborn baby girl who'd been given up at birth by her unwed mother. They named her Marlene, and it wasn't long before she was the center of their universe. In 1962, Jim Olive accepted a job with Gulf Oil and moved his family to Guayaquil, Ecuador. Here, the Olives enjoyed an even grander lifestyle, with a large villa and an army of servants. Marlene had grown to be a delightful toddler who had developed a close bond with her adoptive father. Her relationship with Naomi, though, was less congenial. Left alone for long periods of time due to her husband's demanding work hours, Naomi Olive had taken to the bottle and was already showing the first signs of the mental illness that would plague her for the rest of her life. She was drunk, which was often. She'd take out her frustrations on her daughter, screaming at her and taunting her about her real mother, who Naomi claimed had been a prostitute. This abuse continued as Marlene aged and eventually started arguing back. As the relationship became increasingly fractious, mother and daughter were often at each other's throats, with Jim having to step in and separate them. Then in 1973, Jim lost his job with Gulf Oil and announced to his family that they were moving back to the United States. To Marlene, now 13, it was a disaster. She'd spent most of her life in Ecuador and loved it there. She just desperately wanted to stay. Everything she'd heard about the lifestyles of teens in the United States was negative. She was particularly concerned about the drug culture, fearful that she'd be sucked into it. She said as much to her father. He laughed it off. Marlene was a good girl who did well in school. He had no reason to believe that it would be any different after they returned home. And so, in 1973, Jim Olive moved his family to affluent Marin County, California. He no longer had a fat corporate salary to rely on, but to a go-getter like Jim, that was a minor and temporary problem. He quickly acquired a partner and set up a business that offered consulting services. That, of course, took a serious chunk of his time. Perhaps that is why he appears to have been blissfully unaware of the deepening resentment between Naomi and Marlene. That resentment had now progressed to a point of no return, with taunts and insults openly traded in altercations, sometimes becoming physical. As a result, Marlene began spending more and more time away from the home. Inevitably, she fell in with a bad crowd, a group of teenage girls known for their drug-taking and promiscuity. Soon the 14-year-old was experimenting with marijuana, cocaine, and LSD, engaging in sex and skipping school to travel to rock concerts. She also developed an interest in the occult and would boast to friends that she was a member of the Church of Satan. That wasn't the only story she made up. She boasted that she had appeared in a child porn movie while living in South America, and said that her father was an important man in the Ecuadorian drug trade, and her mode of dress had changed too. She dressed, quite frankly, like a streetwalker. Her platform shoes and ultra-short skirts, augmented by multicolored hair and tons of makeup. At school, she gained a reputation for being easy. The fear she'd expressed to her father about leaving Ecuador appeared to have been a self-fulfilling prophecy. Many kids, of course, rebel during their teens, and some even go as far off the rails as Marlene Olive, before self-correcting as they gain maturity. Marlene, an intelligent girl, might well have come to a similar realization as she matured, but in October 1974, an event occurred that would spin Marlene's life off in an entirely different direction. That was the month that she met 19-year-old Chuck Riley. Chuck was your typical teenage loser, a pudgy high school dropout who never had a girlfriend and was in fact still a virgin when he met Marlene. No one in her circle would have paid him the slightest bit of attention except for one thing. Chuck was a drug dealer who drew his clientele mainly from the local teens. That was how he met Marlene, and after that first meeting, came to the conclusion that he was madly in love with her. Marlene at first spurned Chuck's clumsy advances. He was overweight and awkward, and despite having some street cred as a dealer, he was considered a joke by most of the cool kids that she hung out with. But eventually, after several months, his persistence wore her down, and she agreed to go out with him. Maybe it was the free drugs he gave her, or perhaps it was the expensive gifts he showered her with. Whatever the case, Marlene must soon have realized that Chuck was a blank canvas, someone that she could manipulate to her will. Shortly after she allowed him to have sex with her, the 15-year-old Marlene began pushing the sexually naive Chuck to more and more extreme limits. Once she ordered him to take explicit photos of her, which she said she was going to send to Penthouse magazine. Then she made him don a leather mask and other S&M gear and whip her. On another occasion, she masturbated herself with a loaded .22 pistol that he owned. Taking things even further, she once urinated on his face, while several of her friends stood watching. If Chuck ever wavered, she reminded him that she'd cast a witchcraft spell on him, which made him her slave. Apparently, he believed her. Chuck's relationship with Marlene had a distinct impact on his personality. Whereas before he'd been a jovial loser, eager to please and the butt of all jokes, he now was more assertive, less cordial, not as accommodating. He lost weight and began dressing more fashionably. He started carrying a gun. To Marlene's parents, though, he was just the kind of positive influence she needed in her life. Around them, he was always polite and respectful. Jim and Naomi happily gave their blessing to the relationship. Little did they know that their daughter had already begun nagging her boyfriend to murder them. By now, Marlene's relationship with Naomi had devolved into all-out warfare, and the close bond she'd once enjoyed with Jim had also deteriorated. She blamed him for not backing her up in her fights with Naomi. Things suddenly came to a head in March 1975 when Chuck and Marlene were arrested for shoplifting. No charges were brought, but Jim Olive had finally had enough. He told Marlene that he was going to send her away to school and forbade her from seeing Chuck again. She, of course, disobeyed him and continued meeting with Chuck in secret. During those meetings, she told him that he was going to lose her if he did not do something soon. She encouraged him to find a hitman to get rid of her parents, adding that he could take over Jim's supposed South American drug empire once he was gone. She also issued her usual threats. If Chuck did not get rid of her parents, she was going to break up with him. Chuck Riley was placed in an impossible position. He loved Marlene with all his heart and could not imagine his life without her. He'd once attempted suicide when she told him that she was ending her relationship with him. Now he stood to lose her again. On Saturday, June 21st, 1975, he decided to act. Chuck had been doing acid for several days, and on the day in question he was so spaced out that he was barely able to walk. Several people saw him that morning, shuffling through the affluent Terra Linda neighborhood on his way to the Olive residence. What they would not have seen was the gun tucked into his waistband under his shirt. Marlene and her father were not at home when Chuck arrived, so he entered through an unlocked door and headed for an upstairs bedroom where Naomi lay asleep in a drunken stupor. En route, Chuck had picked up a hammer that he found on the sideboard, and now he lifted it, held it above his head for a brief moment, and then brought it down with all his might. The blow was delivered with such force that the hammered head actually penetrated Naomi's skull and became lodged in her brain cavity. Chuck had to press down with his hand on her head in order to wriggle it free. Then he raised it again and brought it down, then again. And still Naomi wasn't dead. She lay on the bed with her skull a bloody mess of bone shards, blood and brain matter. An odd gurgling sound issued from her throat. It was then that Chuck heard the sound of a vehicle drawing to a stop outside. Jim and Marlene were back. Chuck had to think fast, and in his brain-addled condition, he decided that his best bet was to confront Jim Olive as he entered the house. He rushed downstairs and hid behind a couch, drawing his pistol as he did. But Jim spotted the bulky assassin as soon as he entered the room and demanded that he show himself. Chuck then stood up, his face and clothes spattered with blood and brain matter. "What have you done?" Jim demanded. Then, perhaps realizing the answer to his own question, "I'll kill you." He lunged for Chuck, and Chuck raised the pistol and fired 4 times, killing Jim Olive on the spot. Chuck and Marlene spent the rest of the day cleaning up the crime scene. After nightfall, they loaded the bodies into the family station wagon and drove to China Camp State Park, where they incinerated them in a barbecue pit. The following morning, someone called out the fire service, and a lone fireman was dispatched to extinguish the remaining embers. The firefighter noticed bones among the ashes, but took them to be from a deer. Over the following week, the teenage killers lived together in the death house. They were hardly discreet about their actions, going on a spending spree with Jim Olive's credit cards, inviting friends around to do drugs, and attending a rock concert by the band Yes. During that concert, Marlene suddenly started chanting, "I killed my parents, I killed my parents," over and over again, getting progressively louder and louder. But hardly anyone could hear her over the sound of the band, and those who did took her admission as a joke. The disappearance of the Olives, however, could not remain a secret forever. After trying for several days to contact Jim, his business partner eventually reported him missing to the police. A patrol car was dispatched to make inquiries. Dissatisfied with the answers provided by Marlene, the officers asked her to accompany them to the station. Marlene told several different stories under interrogation. First, she said that her parents had gone to Lake Tahoe for a break. Then she said that Jim had killed Naomi and fled. Then it was Naomi who was the killer. Finally, she admitted to the murders implicating Chuck. He was arrested that same day and quickly cracked under interrogation, confessing to the murders but insisting that Marlene had cast a spell on him and made him do it. Both Chuck and Marlene were charged with the so-called barbecue murders, but as a juvenile she was never going to do hard time. The sentence, when it came, was a mere 2 years in juvenile hall. Chuck, meanwhile, had been tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. That sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Chuck, now in his 50s, remains incarcerated to this day. As for Marlene, she served part of her sentence at the Ventura School before being released to live under supervised care. While on parole, she fled to New York City, where she worked for a time as a prostitute before being arrested and sent back to California to finish her sentence. She was released in 1980 at the age of 21. Since then, Marlene Olive has been in and out of trouble with the law, serving several prison terms for forgery and drug-related charges. She and Chuck only saw each other once more when she visited him in prison in 1981. Both Chuck and Marlene were charged with the so-called barbecue murders, but as a juvenile, she was never going to do hard time. The sentence, when it came, was a mere 2 years in juvenile hall. Chuck, meanwhile, had been tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. That sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Chuck, now in his 50s, remains incarcerated to this day. As for Marlene, she served part of her sentence at the Ventura School before being released alive under supervised care. While on parole, she fled to New York City, where she worked for a time as a prostitute before being arrested and sent back to California to finish her sentence. She was released in 1980 at the age of 21. Since then, Marlene Olive has been in and out of trouble with the law, serving prison terms for forgery and drug-related charges. She and Chuck only saw each other once more when she visited him in prison in 1981. Alright guys, because of the time on this video, I'm not going to put the third story on here, but hopefully the next video will have 3 stories instead of 2. Alright guys, thank you so much for listening. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in my next one. Bye!